Hi, welcome to my home studio. Today I'm in my messy tent where I do all things like plaster and paper mache. Last week you saw me sculpt the two center figures of the rondelle, and today I've divided those two figures up into three parts and I'm going to be casting them in plaster. Enjoy! Okay, now the warm water is completely saturated with plaster and the surface looks like an alien planet. And now I'm going to wait for that to sleek down for a few minutes and then mix it up and then I'll start to cast. Okay, so plaster is all slaked down now, and so I'm going to mix it up. Got my longer glove on so that I don't get plaster down my glove. It's not the most pleasant feeling. I don't do a lot of mixing because the more I mix, the more air bubbles get in there, and I don't want that. They like to get trapped in these little holes, for example. Alright, the first thing I do to help out with all those little air bubbles is I put a thin coat of plaster on the surface of my sculpture. Sometimes you can throw it in, but I find that that doesn't really work very well, and it just splashes plaster everywhere, and it's a messy enough process as it is, let alone with you splashing plaster everywhere. Once I get the plaster in there, I take my air hose, and starting really high up, I try to force the plaster into all those little pockets. The closer I get, the more I reveal pockets where the plaster didn't go in. So then I take a little bit more plaster, try to force it in again, and I keep doing this till I don't see any visible pockets. I still end up getting a few air bubbles here and there, but this helps a lot. The problem with the air bubbles is when you get them, it means that the clay doesn't fill that hole up. Then you have to re-poke it or re-sculpt it. And it's a little frustrating because every single, like a piece like this I'm only casting hopefully once. But on things where I'm casting 100 of them, that one little air bubble starts to really annoy me. Alright, I think I've got everything in there pretty well now. Then I can go ahead and pour the plaster in. Try to get as much of the plaster out of the bucket as possible, because cleaning the buckets is the least favorite part of any plaster process, and it's just waste. It's going to be a pretty heavy mold. Sometimes people put like a hardware cloth or chicken wire in, or they put a layer of burlap in. These are all perfectly fine things. It helps with the strength of your mold. But I find that with this size, I've made plenty of molds this size, and because it's not going through heavy production and I'm not moving it around all over the place, that I don't really need to do that. And sometimes I feel like the chicken wire, when I'm hammering on it later, it might create a stress point. So I'd rather just have it nice and flat. So once I get that poured out, I take a minute to rinse out my bucket so that it's not annoying later. Okay, bucket's washed. Then what I do is I shake the table. And shaking the table, you can kind of see the waves form. And all these bubbles are going to come up to the surface. So any bubbles that did get trapped down near the surface are going to be agitated up to the top. So I usually just do this for a minute or so. I like these folding tables because they are easy to jiggle like this. A note about the buckets. So I have a trap on my sink, so I'm not putting plaster down a drain. A lot of times in schools where you have plumbing without a trap, people just let the plaster harden up in their bucket and then bang it and chip it out later. And that's a perfectly good solution. I find that my buckets last longer if I'm not banging on them, and so I have the trap. You can really see like the bubbles coming to the surface. You don't want to shake so hard that you break the seal or you like jostle the mold and it falls, it comes apart and leaks plaster everywhere. And this is a lot of plaster, so you definitely don't want that to happen. I've had situations where my bucket has broken and I've gotten plaster like inside my boot and just all over me. As you can see, I've got the very messy apron. Trying to avoid plaster explosions is always a good thing. Alright, so about half an hour has passed. The plaster's still pretty warm. It's going through its heat up chemical process. However, it is long enough that it has set up enough that I can steal the boards so that I can go ahead and get my second mold made using the same boards. But it comes off right like that. You can see where the plaster chipped up a little bit. I like to get this ridge off while it's nice and soft still. And the reason you want a nice smooth edge is because if this flakes off, when you're pressing ceramic into it and the plaster gets into the ceramic, it can explode in the kiln. So you don't really want any plaster bits in your finished piece. They can get really sharp. When this plaster gets nice and hard, they're like little knife blades. There's that. This is over. It's about 25 pounds of clay. And I put the resist on the boards earlier, so this comes off pretty easily. So I'm just going to clean this up. You can see the difference between where I didn't put the resist on the back. Alright. So then I just start the whole process again. Okay, while this one sets up, I'm going to take this one apart because I need this pink board. I only have two of these boards so that I could set up the third mold. As I said before, this is about a 25-pound mold. I used about 25 pounds of plaster and 8 liters of water, so it's got some heft to it. So what I'm going to do is try to stand it up and with my chisel kind of like pry it open, and we'll see how that works. Alright, popped out pretty nicely. So now you can see this is the underside. This is the clay that I put around to seal the mold. And now I'm going to pull the original out. You want to be kind of careful. You don't want to gouge the mold, the surface. This should come out pretty easily because the clay is wet. I have the hardest time pulling out the clay when I've let the pattern, the original one, get almost bone dry. Then you have to like dig and dig and dig. So there you go. Other than this little bit, it came right out, so that's nice. That means that there's not a lot of undercut pulls, and it's going to press out really nicely. So this clay, what I'll end up doing is I will just reslake it and use it and sculpt something new out of it. It's got little bits of plaster in it, so this can't be used to make actual finished product, but it works great for sculpting. So there's that. So then what I'm going to do is take a ribbon tool and just clean this upper edge, kind of angle it back and make sure there isn't any plaster ledges trying to trap, because then when I go to put the clay in, it's going to get caught and it won't want to come out of the mold. You can see here, this was a blemish of some plaster that was already on the mold. You can kind of see right here, that's an undercut. So I want to get rid of that as much as possible. The plaster's still pretty soft. It hasn't dried out at all, so it's a good time to do this. Usually once I do the first press, I usually take some time to do this again if I notice anything pulling. You want to do this with a loop tool and not a pointed tool, because it's really easy to accidentally dig in and then you have a line in your surface. Okay, just like that. You can see here there's a little bit of an air bubble there, but for the most part these came out pretty good. I'll probably end up having to like fuss with them when I'm making the final piece, but for the most part I'm pretty pleased. I don't see a lot of air bubbles, so that's good. And then I can sweep it out. So then I'm going to wash it. You can wash it with a little bit of vinegar to cut the Murphy's oil soap. And then I'm going to let it dry, and it's probably going to take about a week to dry out. So while this part of the process is going on, then I'll go ahead and get going on other parts of the mosaic. Right. Then I can use the board, and I do the whole thing once again. All three molds are complete. In all, it took about 5 hours to create all three of these. You can see that they are reverse of how they were in the original, but all the detail is right there. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to elaborate on anything that I might have glossed over in the time lapse. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully you have found this to be interesting. I'm going to be pressing out some of the other components of the mosaic in the next several videos while I wait for these molds to dry. Thanks very much. Have a good night.